I don't know about you, but fantasy maps are often one of the first things that I look to when exploring somebody's world. They serve as such a wonderful piece of storytelling all on its own and makes a great first impression for how people perceive your world. Not only does it make the experience way more immersive for the audience, it's also really great for the creator too. As somebody that's still expanding on their world, there's definitely some places that are more fleshed out than others, and I go back and reference it all the time. I actually redesigned my map twice, and it's one of my favorite parts of world building. So today I wanted to talk all about fantasy maps, how I made mine, and the importance of having one for your world. Hi everyone, if you don't know me already, my name's Janie. I'm an artist, world builder, and storyteller, and I have a little shop where I make handmade items from my world called Hexium. I've had a map making video like this in my head for so long, and I'm so excited to bring it to you today because I love maps. I'm so passionate about them. Making the map of my world Hexium was one of the most exciting parts, but it can be really overwhelming to make sure you include everything that you want to. Like I said, I ended up redesigning my map completely, and as you can see, I definitely learned a thing or two along the way. So yeah, if you want to learn more about Hexium, I've talked about it a lot in my past two videos, but today is just going to be all about my map making process, and hopefully I'll give some useful advice for you to take away when you're making your own maps. I'm wearing my Hot Topic Lord of the Rings sweater today, so we are ready to go. So the first thing that you really have to think of is the shapes or the composition of your map. There's really no wrong way to do this. I've seen loads of different methods, one of the most common being the rice method, where you spill either rice or beans on your paper and you roughly outline the shape to get a nice organic look and feel. I think that's a really cool and effective way to do it, but I also really encourage making more informed decisions with the shapes on your map. So before you make that decision, you kind of need to consider where your world sits on a scale from fantasy to reality. If we think of it like a sliding scale, my world personally sits very, very far towards fantasy. It's pretty far removed from reality, and I really like having unexplained whimsy. So when I was making my shapes, I knew I was making a very playful world with a bunch of witchy and folklore inspired characters. So I wasn't too concerned with if it was logical from Earth's geometry's perspective. I just wanted to kind of have a bit of fun with it. So what I did is that I made my regions based off of classic witchy symbols. One of my nations is Outramul, and it is an exploding potion bottle. Then there's Djorsum, which is a bat, and Venefica is a witch hat. It may not look obvious right away, except for maybe the bat, but I just think it's a really nice little touch. If you're going for something a bit more gritty and realistic, then I think something similar to the rice method is a really great idea. However, if you do have multiple land masses instead of just one big one, then you might want to think of if there was ever like a Pangea equivalent. This is just so that the continents look pretty next to each other and it doesn't just look like shapes on paper. Kind of like how Africa and South America look like two puzzle pieces that could fit together. I also definitely encourage thinking ahead and paying close attention to the coastlines of your world. It's good to have some interesting bay areas where a capital city could lie, or some jagged capes where a medieval castle might sit, and just things like that. But yeah, it all really just depends on the map that you're making for your world. I mean, if it's something more like Tolkien's Middle-earth, then the shape really doesn't matter, and he just has that one coastline. One of my favorite fantasy maps is actually from the anime/manga Hunter x Hunter. I think it's really funny because it started with one complete map, and then much later on in the series it was revealed that the world that we've been seeing is actually in a big lake, and it's surrounded by a scary dark continent. I mean, I have no idea if the creator had that in mind from the beginning, but my theory is that he had this world and then was like, I actually need more land, and then just decided to expand it in this really cool and eccentric way. I thought that was a good one to mention because if you're worried about like fitting everything in that you want to fit and that you'll remember something later on after you've already made the map, then you can always just expand it in some kind of fun and creative way. I love little things like that, and honestly there's no reason that fantasy needs to follow the same rules as Earth. But yeah, you really can't go too wrong here. I recommend just getting a piece of paper and doing a bunch of tiny sketches of your rough shapes, and eventually you'll find one that you like. So shapes kind of lead directly into the geography side of things, and like I was saying earlier, my map is definitely flawed from a logic perspective. So here you might want to consider that sliding scale of fantasy to reality once again, but to be honest, it even more so depends on if you're a hard or a soft world builder. And if you're unfamiliar, hard versus soft world building kind of just depends on the level of detail you like going into about your world. Hard being extreme and rigorous rules about how the world works, and soft leaving a bit more up to the viewer's imagination. My world probably sits a little bit more towards soft world building, but I do enjoy going into depth about more things than others. For example, I love culture. I illustrate the foods, the local flora and fauna of the area. But when it comes to the inner workings of the rules and the magic system, I like it to be a bit more broad and up to the viewer's imagination. Sometimes I find gaps or little things that don't make sense, but I am a firm believer that if something doesn't make sense in your world, then there's always a creative solution to fix it. It is fantasy after all, and you make the rules. But yeah, basically I don't want to say to make things make sense from an earthly geographical perspective, because I think that's the whole fun in fantasy, is that it is different from our world. I mean, if you want to put deserts next to tundras, that's fine. Who's gonna stop you? However, if you do lean a bit more towards hard world building, then you might consider some of the nitty-gritty factors. Some examples of what I mean are wind currents. Is there an equator? Is it hot in the north and cold in the south? Is there even a north and south? I pick and choose the subjects that I like to go into detail in, because I think if you are a hard world builder, you could absolutely get lost in the little details forever. So I personally enjoy building up the characters and the cultures a bit more, and I put more focus into that than some of the things like geography. And you might be the opposite. But yeah, I just have to limit myself or I'll just completely neglect the actual stories going on in my world. But yeah, I don't want to sit here and tell you to do research into Earth's geography and make sure your world correlates with that, because it just doesn't have to. So the next thing that I want to talk about were icons and symbols. Having creative map symbols brought my map to another level when I redid it, and to be honest, it's probably the most notable thing about it. I think illustrating your places through small icons really helps give the viewer a glimpse or a preview into your world. It can also help set the tone for the place so that you can reference it later on if you're like me, where you build up one place at a time. It just adds so much story and depth, and overall it keeps the viewer looking at your world for longer. Now, when I look back to my first map, it just feels a bit empty when I compare it to my current one, which is full of whimsy and life. I think it's quite good to have a busy map, but you might want to take a different approach. In real life, there are two primary types of maps, that being physical and political. Political highlights countries, cities, counties, etc., while physical focuses on the geography of the place. I definitely did a mix of mine in both. I really liked highlighting some of the notable cities alongside the physical landmarks of my world. Maybe you just want to focus on your cities and bring more attention to the landscape through color, or maybe you'll want to focus on the geography alone. But if you do want to mix it like mine, then I really do recommend having something to differentiate the two on the map. For example, all of my towns are marked with a star and all of my capital cities are marked with a pentagram. Physical territories like the Galita Mountains and the Wandering Forest are written in orange text so that it doesn't confuse with the cities. And lastly, this is something I just don't see too much in fantasy maps, and that is considering water landmarks. I think it's a really nice touch to have something going on in the sea, even if it's just notable shipwrecks, coral reefs, cool bays, or something like that. And then you can just think of an icon to represent it. However, it definitely will clash with what's on land if it's not differentiated by color, so like you can see in mine, I drew all my icons in a slightly darker blue than the water. And since we're talking about color, I thought I'd have a super short section where I just talk about that for a minute. So this will depend entirely on preference again, but for me personally, I feel like using bright colors was a way for me to kind of jump outside of that traditional Tolkien-esque fantasy map look. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that style of map. I think they are aesthetic and beautiful, and I would mount them all over my walls if I could. But if you are looking to convey a different tone or make your map pop a little bit, then color is a great way to kind of differentiate yourself from that. So I guess I just wanted to say you don't necessarily have to make it look earthly. Once again, I know that's been like the majority of my advice throughout this video. Your grasslands don't have to be green and water doesn't have to be blue, but I do think it can be good to stick to a relatively limited color palette. So like you can see in mine, I stick to a turquoise, orange, and purple. But if you are going for a more old-timey rustic feel, it can be really good to stick to a monochrome yellowish color and just have lots of textures and shading in it. But yeah, I just wanted to draw attention to that because when I was making my first map, I didn't even really consider jumping outside of the box with color. So the last thing I wanted to talk about are names. Naming conventions did not really come naturally to me at first. In my very first map, everything came from a Latin root word, and I just wasn't really satisfied with a lot of them. And since I have a quite playful world, I ended up taking a more playful shift with my names. For example, I switched the Canopia jungle to be the fungal jungle, and the town of Palouse became Goop Village. I think it better suited me and the world that I made, plus it was just a bit more fun. But yeah, it's all just dependent on your world, so if you're kind of on the opposite of that sliding scale from me, then taking root words from other languages can always be a good idea. I found that Latin, Celtic, and Nordic languages are all a really good way to go. That's not to say to just slap a random name on everything. You definitely want to think about the history and the stories of the places you're naming as well, just so that when your audience sees it on the map, then they'll kind of form an instant image in their head of what it looks like. For example, on my map, I have some locations like Potion Falls, Creaky Canyon, and the Desert of Ghouls, and you kind of get an idea of what they might look like in your head. But yeah, just think about its history and why the town might have been named it by the people that used to live there. My world is a bit on the sillier side, so Goop Village is just named Goop Village because it's a swamp and it's super goopy there, and it can be something that simple, or it can be something a bit more in-depth with more storytelling. I definitely took naming way too seriously at first, and it just doesn't really have to be. To be honest, most of the time, I come up with a cool name in my head and then think about the story and history behind it later on. So don't let yourself get too lost in the details. You don't have to write out the story for each and every single little place on your map. You can just go back and do it later, and there's always going to be some kind of connection to find with the name. A lot of the names in my world don't necessarily have a rhyme or reason. For example, I got attached to a good few of the Latin names in my original map, and I just carried them over into my current one. And then I have this vineyard that my partner named Gronwyn Vineyard because he's Welsh and it literally just means grape in Welsh. I also probably didn't pronounce that correctly because Welsh is my worst enemy. And then I have another place that's named CC, and it's known for its scientific and magical research, and it's literally just the first 3 letters of science twice. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there necessarily has to be a consistency. I think it's honestly just more important that you have fun with it. And I also always encourage a good pun or alliteration when it's available. So yeah, those were kind of the main points that I looked out for when creating my map. And I know a lot of this video was just kind of me saying, you can't do anything wrong, just do what you want. But I do genuinely believe that. I've watched a lot of map making videos and they all give really, really wonderful advice on how you should lay out your world, and I kind of just wanted to offer a different perspective on it. I personally think that the further you branch out from reality, the more fun and interesting your world can be. And even if you decide that you hate your map in a year, like I did with mine, you can just change it and the world will keep turning. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. If any of you have easily accessible links to your fantasy maps, I would love to look at them. Feel free to drop those below. You would honestly be doing me a great favor because I love looking at maps. Yeah, if there's any specific content you guys want to see around world building soon, please feel free to let me know below. This was actually my last video I had planned, so I've got to get cooking. And yeah, as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon.